Mark, if you like to introduce yourself briefly, and then we kick it off. And of course, we are open to questions. Mark, feel free to prompt whenever you think we should provide some room for questions. Stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel. My name is Mark Richardson. I'm the project lead at Bancor. I've been working there since the beginning of 2021 on an official contractor basis, and since 2020 first as an anonymous volunteer for the project. And I've been the project lead there since October of 2022. Vasily and I have known each other since way back in those days during sort of the early stages of TE Academy. And I think this is Phil and ours first opportunity to speak together. I wanted to premise this panel, what I see my purpose is here, because this is, I think, a little different from the kind of panels that you usually see at conferences, maybe not so much at ECC, but certainly at things like Token 2049 or something, where often the panelists are here to essentially pitch you on the strength, the investability of an idea or something like that. And it's the moderator's job to sort of make those ideas as compelling as possible or give the panelists room to present those ideas. That's not the case today. When Angela asked me to do this, she used the word peer review, which for me means to scrutinize and criticize. Right? It is the strengths of the ideas that we've seen our two speakers present will have to stand up to that scrutiny and criticism. Now that's not to say that it's mean-spirited, but it might not feel as pampering, I think as some panels often do. Now my other purpose is to bring some structure, right, to the conversation, some continuity, some shared synteny between the intellectual ideas that we've seen both of our speakers present. And from the outset, it seems that these are two very disparate topics. I'm going to try and convince you otherwise. I actually selected these two speakers as a part of the process leading up to today, so this is no accident. You were both handpicked, right, from a very long list of potential speakers, and I want you to know that I'm very pleased that you guys accepted this invitation, and it's my honor to be doing this process with you now. So I think the structure that I decided on and that I shared with you guys leading up to ECC is that we're essentially going to take the macro view that Vasily's expertise leans into, and then slowly sort of move down the funnel towards the the minutiae of the engineering decisions that Phil is explicitly dealing with. Now, Vasily, from Valueverse has sprung forth, I would say, from work that you've been doing since long before Valueverse would have been completely conceptualized. You presented, I think, just briefly a familiar image to me, the sort of periodic table of tokens. I think a really good place to start this conversation would be if you could actually just tell the audience how that came about. Maybe in the beginning stages of token engineering discussions, and like how long it took to even develop that, and whether or not it's changed over time.
Yep. You mean the periodic table itself, or the just basic approach to distinguish origins of value mechanisms and implementations?
As you wish, but I think that the thing I want to drive at is that this periodic table is something that you're trying to discern intrinsic properties, right, of the value of a token. This isn't, you're not speculating on the price of a token necessarily. It's more exact than that. Yeah. So I think all my work started at the point when I understood that discount token is not a separate class of tokens, but it is a conditional action, the amount of product that you bought or used with the discount, and the amount of cash flow that you essentially saved from using some token as a discount token. So this was I think the first step when I started to think about all of this, because I understood this is not like discount token is not like a monolithic type of thing. It can be subdivided, and then I start to see consensus like work tokens, and the periodic table was much later, because so I created this origins of value and mechanisms, and I shared it with Angela, and
So I showed it a lot, but there was no table, and Angela said me, Vasily, if you want to present it on, on some place, maybe it was a TE weekly reads. Because I shared a lot about the table that I will create it, but I never created. And she said me, if you will not create it, I cannot put you, invite you to this newsletter. I said, oh my God, I need to do it super fast. And I created it over 4 hours because I understood that I have enough mechanisms that I identified to combine them into some structure that has some rows and stuff, and I can make some logic there. Not just put there to have some picture, but have a logic why this mechanism is in this like square. So this is how it happened.
Now, when you first started speaking to me about that, I think around 2020, I think one of the pieces of feedback that I had for you then is that it's almost like you're imposing a superficially well-defined structure, right, over something that is continuous, right? Like it wasn't clear to me then, and maybe it's still not clear to me, that you can necessarily discretize the types of value capture in such a clean way, and that by doing so, you may be obfuscating some of the nuance there in the sort of continuum and how these things bleed over. One of the things you said to me then was like, yes, but these things compose together. Things don't necessarily fit into a single category, but they might belong to several different categories at the same time. I think I have a similar piece of criticism to give to you today, which is that with the AI models in particular, one of the things that they are demonstrably bad at is understanding nuance, right? And I wonder if you could comment for me on how much faith you actually have in the AI's ability to do the work that you have been doing, right, since 2020, in the sense that, the AI may not be able to detect the kind of hubris, right, that people inject into their white papers in order to describe their token that you might decide to remove from the analysis, whereas the AI is going to take it at face value, things like that.
So for AI, I think the most important step, the first one is to identify all origins of value, distinct ones in the token, and second is to combine them into the mechanisms. And of course, the more verified cases that are like 100% correct we have, the better is AI. From one point of view. From other point of view, so we have a special like a database. What is, for example, the value transfer, right? In different projects that we are 100% sure that it's correct. And the AI see, okay, value transfer in Chainlink is this, value transfer in Ethereum is this, value transfer in USDT, in USDT we don't have value transfer. In Bitcoin is this, for example. So I think that like a lot of tokens on the market are similar. Even we have a lot of them, but they have different changes in design. For example, water scroll tokenomics, right? Very popular, like family of mechanisms, right? We have curve, we have, for example, velodrome, we have aerodrome. If you will see, there are different structures, but the overall principle is the same. You lock token for a long time, aligning, incentives of the community and preventing some governance attacks, so you can, borrow token, vote for something bad, and return it on the lower price, efficiently shortening it, right? So I have faith in AI to analyze tokens and create like database records, but about the future investment analysis, I think it's much more complicated because it has much more factors than intrinsic value. So this is the bigger pain point for me than just create a database. So I think creating database is easier than creating results on top of the database.
Now, some of that nuance that I'm not saying that I'm not confident that I'm not saying that the AI can't do it. I'm just saying my confidence is low, that I think AI is capable of understanding that level of nuance. And it relates to something that Phil had in his presentation as well. And so Phil, I'd like to ask you to comment on this very briefly. But you pointed out that there is, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that you mentioned, but specifically that there are design aspects to the debt market that you're hoping to create. Things like you said that there might be scores attached, right, to these NFT tokens, or maybe there won't be an NFT token. You mentioned that you might have a liquidity pool for secondary markets, which implies at least an ERC20 standard, or at the very least an ERC 1155 standard, and that it's possible, at least in, I know I have a strong opinion about it, but I think that those specific design choices will actually impact, the way that one of these tokens would be viewed under whether it's, Vasily's rubric or any other rubric. And so I wanted to get your, first, whether or not you even agree with me. Like, do these specific design choices fundamentally impact the nature of the vehicle that you have at the end? Or is it, is it more, well, you agree with me, so go ahead.
No, yes, I mean, that's the whole point. The whole point of, if it would not affect it, then we could just design one pipeline for everything, and it would go through, and then, whatever happens. There are dimensions to it. One is, I mentioned at the very end, legal. Let's put that aside for now, because I think that's not relevant for what we're discussing now. The other one is also getting the liquidity into the market. So the question is, what are you actually selling, and who could be actually interested in buying it? And depending on the structure, again, if you think about the example on the construction yard, it's a very specific thing, very narrowly defined. How many actors in the market right now are able to actually think about the pricing for this thing? These exist, but they are specialized. So there's no point in trying to make it overcomplicated, trying to cater to a mass market in a sense, or trying to cater to non-sophisticated actors that do not have their own pricing in place. If you think about factoring, on the other hand, there are factoring companies in this world out there, and what they do is they basically provide a service for the companies involved, good or bad, let's put that aside, and then they are basically tapping into financial markets in different ways. They're refunding it through specific vehicles, they may be securitizing things, there might be also OTC sales to explicit actors in the market. On that regard, I think improving that pipeline, maybe creating more efficiency, is clearly something. But for that to work, you can't expect final people who buy this at all levels, except if you're really just, again, tapping into the same market as before. You can't expect them to do the pricing only on their own. So you need to provide information and have actors as basically intermediaries and as service providers in such a market in order to reach the end of that pipeline.
Yeah, okay. You and I have consensus, I think, on this specific point. I want to push you a little bit farther, though, which is that one of the things that you sort of were a little bit ambiguous about during your presentation was that with respect to the risk property, right, of the debt itself, this is either something that you build into the at the protocol level, or you sort of allow market participants to shoulder the responsibility for that themselves. And I think that at a fundamental level, that's like night and day, right? That it changes the asset fundamentally. I was hoping you could discuss.
Yes. Okay, so I agree with you. And in fact, the design we have is in some sense trying to accommodate this in the following way. When I said before that we have this digitalization process, which has its own risks, by the way, which I brushed a bit aside, that we just say it's solvable, and in a specific factoring case, it is. We can have a high degree of confidence in of being solved. The question is basically, what is the instrument then doing? And let's say, give you a counterexample to what we do. Let's say we would be directly saying this goes onto a pool. And then basically something in the pool happens. The problem with this is, depending on what you do, how does the pricing actually work? How, algorithmically, and is it actually accurate? Would it basically work in a market environment? So the idea is to have basically one step in between, which is the second module, this NFT step, where we basically take a very conservative and totally non-opinionated stance that we say each title is in itself idiosyncratic, which is not realistic, but it's basically a safety barrier, if you want. From that moment on, you can apply it, and you can say, look, I'm looking at this project, again, construction yard example, it's really idiosyncratic. There's no point in bunching it together. In other cases, like the invoice factoring for a specific segment of the market, which might be relatively risk-free at some level, it doesn't make sense to think everything is separate. But the idea of having this barrier in between is exactly for allowing different use cases and applying it and basically specializing it to the specific use case at hand.
Yes, okay. Vasily, okay. with respect, so one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, right? One of the massive problems that we have is that there are so many tokens and there is so much information, and not even all of that information is good, right? There's probably equal parts information and disinformation, or maybe even more disinformation than actual information. And that's usually, like, when people hear that, it's very natural to assume that, okay, that's a one token per project problem. Like, you know, the fact that there's too many tokens might suggest that there's too many projects or something. But actually, the day has long come and gone where you can necessarily say that for each project there is one token, right? Even within the Curve universe, for example, there were things like, the Curve governance token, and then various wrappers on that through things like convex finance and other things. And so you end up with this entire, plethora of related tokens. And this is going to come back to something that Phil is doing, but I was wondering if I could get your comment just quickly on whether or not within that collection of related tokens that you can have like dramatically different sort of characteristics attached to each one of them in terms of the rubric that you're applying at Valueverse.
Sorry, I don't understand. The question is why we are sure that it's all correct in our database or not?
Just high level. Is it a reasonable expectation that all of the tokens associated with a single project will have a very similar sort of value characteristic according to the Valueverse rubric, or can you get arbitrarily different kinds of tokens?
Of course, we can get different because, for example, Curve has a VT economics, and for example, Convex, they don't have VT economics. You have just a vote lock. You don't have different duration there. So it looks similar, but works differently. And for example, Stake DAO, as I remember, is also VT economics. I think that tokens can have totally different properties, and it is regulated only by the necessity of something. So you can even maybe create, the stable coin on top of Curve that uses Curve as collateral theoretically. But of course, maybe it's not a good choice because Curve is volatile and doesn't have a lot of liquidity for liquidations. We all understand that, but I mean, theoretically, you can even build some separate third-party stable coin on top of Curve token. This Curve token will be connected with the the stable coin will be connected with Curve, because if Curve value grows, you can mint more stable coin against it, use it more, far more, get more fees.
Yeah. Okay. And we haven't seen it, I think, with Curve, or maybe we have, but I might not be familiar enough with it. But certainly, projects like Compound and Aave have very recently sort of overhauled, their tokenomics process, and sort of decided that they want to discard, right, some of these auxiliary tokens that were created in the wake of the success that Curve was having with its, ecosystem, and instead sort of bring everything back to, having a single token. I wonder, when you see those kinds of consolidation processes, is it necessarily that you just kind of sum all of the characteristics, or are there these are these economies somehow less than the sum of their parts or more than the sum of their parts? Like, let's talk about this consolidation.
It's always different. So, for example, what I know about Aave, they introduced the proposal to add some protocol fees in the token, as I remember. So, and it significantly updates the future value state of the token, because we'll have a new source of income, which is evidently will boost the token, like at least some fundamental value that you can assume for it. So, and for Compound, as I remember, it was just a governance token where you have conditional action and governance, so you can just vote. You even don't need to stake, because it's just like you need to have a tokens before the date of the proposal, or the block of the proposal, and Uniswap copied this approach a long time ago. I don't know anything that is going with Compound token, but with AI, hopefully we will automatically assume what is going on there. But I think that it's not a kind of consolidation. Probably it's they just build a new token on top of existing one, understanding all previous mistakes and problems that were there. For example, in Aave, you remember this safety model, right? That was paying first from emission, then, as I remember, from fees, and now they want to make fees for all token holders under some conditions. So, because now it became evident that in DeFi, if you have a good fee stream, why not to share it with token holders if you can find a way to do that?
The reason I wanted to talk about this is that during Phil's presentation, you mentioned specifically, and in not much detail, and I understand in 20 minutes it's hard to get that kind of detail in. But you mentioned a sort of tranched marketplace, right, where you would expect certain risk levels, I think, to be distributed, or this is at least what I expected that you were referring to. And for each one of those tranches, right, this could either be represented by a unique ERC20 contract, for example, and this would resemble, I imagine that you're inspired by things like insurance-linked securities markets and how those are structured. And one of the questions, I've got a lot of questions about that, and it's possible that some of them can't be answered. But first of all, is my impression the correct one, right? Are you thinking rather than have NFTs representing specific debt, that rather someone puts together a prospectus or something, and that there's like a basket of these debts that are now under a specific ERC20 contract?
It's getting boring. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Maybe let me comment on the tranching. So again, this module 2, basically, where we make a conservative stance on each title being basically idiosyncratic, is just in some sense to keep the flexibility down the road if we are entering a market where the fungibility or the comparability, the similarity between different underlying titles is not automatically given. The whole point about having this standard second phase, basically, and tying it together with the risk assessment is to kind of get to a point where we can bundle things together in different ways. Now, there is, of course, a constraint. I'll give you an example. If the market basically supports, I make it up, 10 invoices per month, they are all wildly different. They have wildly different risks because we're talking about, a corporate doing the invoice and basically a startup doing the invoice. The risk will be wildly different. So one of the things that is very hard to predict and needs to be assessed on the spot for the specific market through quantitative reasoning and also for market design is how thick can the market be in principle. That depends on supply as well as demand. I think demand for yield is less of a problem, and in particular, if you can provide information and pricing actually can be supported and can become transparent over time. The question is the supply, and there is no recipe against it in some sense, just that you need to prepare. And in some cases, it might not even sense to set up the pipeline, right? If the volume is too little, then no point doing it. And then there is a secondary question. One is that if you think about it traditionally, there might be actually reasons why these markets are small is because they're regionally clustered, even though if you compare regions, actually they're relatively similar. Again, you can make a case for Germany or other European countries as well. So that one way of getting a thick enough market is actually by doing this kind of digitalization blockchain thing, because you're increasing the reach. This is a typical thing happening in, again, countries like Germany, where SMEs go to their local bank. Clearly that specific thing will not be well priced for them because they have a local, partial monopoly. Now, if you tap into a larger market, then it might actually be achievable that you have these tranches and they are thick enough that it actually makes sense to have them, right? Let's say we do an auction. Does it make sense to have an auction? And keep in mind, we're talking about things that are short-lived, 30, 60, 90 days. So you were thinking about the duration of a year. How many cycles actually can we auction off and synchronize? Which is not so, there are also details there which need to be taken into account. And then there is the pool, where, for instance, the synchronization of maturity is much simpler there because you don't basically can ignore it from the capital provision side. Sorry, I started off and I wandered off. Did I actually answer your question?
I think you've done, you got close enough to where I needed it. The reason why this is significant, first of all, is because we haven't, it's not true that tranched systems haven't already existed in DeFi before, right? You might recall, like Bondbridge, for example, I think was the first to implement something that was like the splitting image of something that you might see in traditional finance. And they also had ERC20 contracts specific to each tranche. And so, Vasily, back over to you. If we were to apply the rubric, right, from Valueverse, let's say that that you were hired as like a consultant, right, to advise on a project like this. Obviously, there are all kinds of decisions that need to be made here. Some of them are about practicability and engineering, implementation challenges, and smart contract security. And some of those things aren't necessarily always aligned with the value capture properties of the token and the system itself and things like that. And so I wanted to ask, in a general sort of sense, what would be your objective advice, right, for structuring these kinds of things? Do you always prioritize, right, or is it true that you can even prioritize the categorization of the token of tokens underneath the rubric that you've developed, or is it more pragmatic than that? Do you sometimes need to say, well, it might not look like it has the best value capture now, but at least it's implementable, that sort of thing?
Yeah, Mark. As I understand, the question is how to design an utility token for this project on top of all these depths that will be created. So depth itself is a representation. So the token, the NFT token representing the depth, is a representation of real depth, which is existing, right? This depth, it has some recurring payments, it has some interest rate. If the interest rate is positive, not negative, it means that we have some future cash flow. If I own a debt, assuming the debt will be fully paid with all the interest rate, I will get a cash flow, right? So I see this as a representation and a future cash flow, and all the technical instruments that are used, oracles, smart contracts as well, they're all built around making this representation working well, I think. Because you need to know the price, you need to calculate the default score, like there's some chance that will be defaulted. So this is basically a representation, and using all these oracles, you try to notify owner of this token about the real properties of the debt, what is really going on. So on top of this debt universe, right? You will have thousands or hundreds of thousands of debts. If this system will be scaled enough, right, it will work well, for example. So it means that. And you also want to make these trenches because you can combine it to the pools. If you have a lot of depths with similar properties, you can combine it into the pools. So what we have here, we have a lot of cash flow, so you can distribute some cash flow to token holders, but of course it's evident. Do we have some governance possibility? I don't know, but I think that probably you can also get an access of people who can create debt and maybe underwrite debt in this system and make some money on that, because it's something that is not you can't allow everyone to issue debt, right? You can allow everyone to underwrite debt, for example. So I think you get a cash flow in some form. I mean, if you, for example, do a buyback and burn, or you do some direct dividends, or you do something else, it's anyway cash flow. Even if you do a discount, it's also a cash flow, but paid in natural form. So I always understand that this is a cash flow. So you have a cash flow in some variation, you have governance, you have an access. So this is a three type of origins of value that I see from the first side. Maybe there is a chance to do some kind of water scroll, because why water scroll is so popular? Because owners want people to lock tokens, right? Because they want to avoid selling. But this is for speculators. But at the same time we understand that these token lockups for a long time protecting the system from governance attacks, and this because if you lock the token for a long time, you don't have any motivation to vote in a way that will crash your system. This is the assumption in general. Of course, there are some bribes, and we saw how in Curve, for example, bribes change it. The whole understanding of what people want to vote for and how. So, I think if you will ask me how to do the token, and we go for a coffee for 1 hour, and we'll sit and just think from scratch, just some friendly advice, no responsibility for that, right? For example, I will do what's called tokenomics, will get some fees from it to make token holders also getting some profits, for example. Also will provide some discounts. If you have a big word scroll position, you have some discount on something, because I think there are some services and the governance, for example, on the register of people who can issue debt, who can underwrite debt, and you also need to have some staked tokens that can be alienated for doing these actions, because if you do these actions incorrectly, for example, you do on purpose not correct underwriting of debt or something, you can be slashed, for example. So something like this.
Of course. Thanks. Maybe let me tie into something which I think is very much related on evaluation and also about the tooling we heard about. One of the advantages of doing something what we do in principle, not immediately but down the road, is obviously also the traceability and the transparency of information that gets basically assembled over time. And one of the questions that we have right from the start, and which is you can't answer it basically purely theoretically, but you have to also explore it and you have to try it out at some level, is what information is actually needed for which parties and for what specific scenario. Providing this information, though, is obviously important in a way that you can actually inform the pricing along the chain. So again, if you're moving things by chain, I mean the finance supply chain in some sense. So party A, party B has to adapt, and then sending it to C, maybe to D. And as you mentioned, there might be securitization steps, there might be other forms of refunding happening, which change the nature of the instrument, and which might also, we have seen this, 2007, 2008, that information basically is lost, and that causes a lot of trouble in the pricing. And one of the goals clearly is not to do that, but instead to have a way and identify information that is actually relevant. That's also linking up to you. I mean, if you have pricing models basically that require certain information, that information is not there, and it might be not totally obvious that the information should be provided at the beginning. Over time, it should actually be provided. So there is that thing is not we're designing it and let's go to the holiday and goodbye. We will not. It is meant to evolve, and there are many questions in the specific information, but also in the structuring that we will evolve over time.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because it was one of the things that I wrote down very early in your talk, when you said that you had listed a few of the attributes of tokens, being like standard and composable and this kind of thing, and that the code base that you're developing, or the framework that you're developing, is intended to be modular, reusable, upgradable, this kind of thing. And it's it's again one of these cases where particularly at the speed at which blockchain development moves, versioning becomes a huge problem, right? And it seems like you're saying two different things, right? Because on the one hand, when you're trying to produce a monolithic standard that's supposed to exist in perpetuity, like Simon de la Rivier's ERC20 standard, right, which was perfect when it was created and will be perfect for the rest of human existence. And then what you're saying is, okay, we like this idea because we can reuse this thing, and this is why we're attracted to this paradigm. But then say that, well, but we expect to evolve over time, these kinds of things. Like, resolve this conflict for me.
I mean, I don't see a conflict, honestly, because first of all, I said before, it's work in progress. It's not like the thing is deployed and we shipped it and that's it. The thing that we are designing at the moment, it's really in a development phase. So the classical distinction between development, testing, deployment, that's similar what I see here. But the question is, if we are now designing, let's say, a fully fleshed out pipeline that is basically monolithic from end to end, then we test it and we feel, oh, this works. But then the lawyer comes along and says, guys, what are you doing? So in some sense, the fact that it's modular and modifiable is exactly for, in the first phase of setting it and adapting it to a specific market, it has to evolve up to a point where we can test it and where we can verify, yes, it's working in an effective way. It actually creates a thick market. It's actually legally sound also. We got basically cleared. It's regulatory sound. That's why we want to have a building block, that we can adapt it to a specific scenario, can evolve it. Eventually, of course, in that specific market, it should mature, and then it should not be about, hey, we're changing, to version 5 in one go. It should be stable. But at the moment, I think there is a lot of uncertainty about many of these components. And that's why we emphasize this. And maybe also on the market design side, there is a contingency. Depending on what you structure in the beginning, let's say the primary market has a lot of effects, legally, regulatory, but also technically, what you can do just from a market design perspective for the secondary market. And we have to be careful. If we now basically make a choice, this is it, that's the component, we are not changing it, what do we do then? Right? If there is no secondary market, maybe there is no demand for it, then we would be stuck.
I feel like you may have started making some of those decisions already, right? For example, you mentioned that in your modules you had, I think number 1 was the Oracle, right? This is an irreversible design choice once it's built into it in general, you also had, I remember you struck off a couple of things, but then the secondary market, I think, was point number 5-ish or something on the list. And then on the next slide is where we sort of went into the ambiguity between NFTs or whether or not we're going to have liquidity pools and that sort of thing. So, okay, fine. Maybe there is no conflict with respect to versioning, and I concede the point. I do think that there's a conflict between Oracle pricing and liquidity pool-based pricing in certain circumstances. Obviously, not across the board, but I want clarity from you on that specific point, because if you are using something like an Oracle price feed, first of all, what do you mean, right? Is the Oracle just providing off-chain data in terms of that the risk has been evaluated as a certain number, or does this, what is the Oracle doing there? And then, how do you see that participating in a liquidity pool-based secondary market?
Okay, I mean, in principle, there are two. I mean, I didn't say it explicitly, but the risk module itself might be an Oracle. You can conceive it like that. The first Oracle basically has a much more primitive thing. I'm a construction company. How can you make sure that the contract actually exists between me and the other company? It's a very mundane thing. Is the invoice that in the factoring case I want to basically factor, is it actually real or not? That's basically it. It's basically about proving that there is some kind of, let's call it asset or underlying that I'm basically want to base my claim on, my token claim, that it actually exists. Now, to be fair, and I agree with you, this is not harmless at all. In the specific factoring use case, we basically bypass the whole problem because, as I mentioned initially, in that specific use case, there is a government-enforced system that if you're uploading your invoice and you're tampering with it, you are in deep trouble. So we can basically, it does not mean that you get money back, and there could be other reasons, and we have to think about this. But in some sense, the whole problem is orders of magnitude simpler at some level, specific for also if you don't start, if you whitelist companies basically active in that system. On the pricing itself, on the risk assessment, yes. So this is actually one of the things we have question marks. It is clear to us that let's say for the factoring case, we actually need some form of assessment from third parties. And obviously what we do, let's say we are building a pool, and what do we do actually if the assessment is just bad or wrong? Now, first of all, we have to think about ways of how to ensure the quality. This is basically off-chain. This is just good business operations doing it. Moving forward and thinking more long-term, you can also think about gathering information about this. In principle, it's not easy, but in principle it's doable, and it actually ties also into an evaluation. Are these risk assessments actually correct? Because, think about the instrument we have, right? You get a payment at the beginning, and then you have to do a payment at the end, basically a coupon, right? So it's structurally very simple. This is, let's say, 90 days. And you either make it, it's incomplete, or you basically default. So the typical thing is a relatively simple risk in the sense of mathematically risking it. You need basically a risk score of how high is the probability of default or only partial payment. In principle now, if you're collecting enough information over time, you should be able to say that service provider XYZ was actually doing a miserable job because they qualified things as A and it turned out to be actually D, right? I'm making it similar that it is. There are lots of practical problems, operational problems on the quantitative side to actually make this true, but at least it's an opening up a design space that you can do and use over time. Now, what this is not solving is the problem of how do you deal with it short term, right? So you need to have some mechanisms in place that if the defaulting goes overhand, which would be an indicator that something is not priced accordingly, that you have to intervene. And this is one of the things we are struggling with. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, and you can ask executive questions.
Totally reasonable. I want to throw a discussion back to Vasily for a moment. And I think I just want to ask a plain question, which is like, what is the purpose of Valueverse, right? Like, do you present it as like a consulting company, right, for crypto projects to use, or is this more like an information provider that people are supposed to approach the way they would something like Wikipedia?
I think that the Valueverse is a data company. I think our main asset is a comprehensive understanding of hundreds or thousands of tokens, which are really needed by someone. I think this is the core, and anything that you can build on top. The valuation models, any kind of AI, like predictions for price or something, is just a products on top. Our main goal is to very correctly assess what we have in the token. I think this is the most important piece of the work, because if this foundation is not correct, we cannot build anything on top. So it's not a consultancy. I'm trying to focus not on consultancy anymore. I try to focus on building this. I want in 6 months that you can just come and build token with AI. This is much more interesting, I think, than just a consultancy. So, but one of the questions is why the information in our database is correct. because we can even, if you have AI, it can read, some outdated contracts, outdated website, information can be incorrect. This is a very good question, and to be perfect, it should have, like kind of digitalizedly curated knowledge graph or something. This is, I think, the next big step that I will need to do in the future. Because now I just showed the general principle how we can decompose token and how can we scale it. It was not, kind of, shilling the project itself. It was more showing that, the approach that I established, that it really works at this moment. But this is only a piece. Of course, I understand that now we have a centralized Oracle, and centralized Oracle is CoinGecko API, right? We rely on it. We trust that CoinGecko provides us true links to the website of the project, right? To the documentation. We trust to the project team that the documentation is correct and that contracts are correct. Maybe there are some new contracts that are not listed at all, right? Maybe we can. So this is all the assumptions, and we understand it now. We fully understand it now. We just, every database record is our vision of the token and like our vision of what we found as information about it. Maybe it's different. So.
Okay. So let's say that we went with a type of, specific custom utility token, right? That somehow captures let's say the profitability, right, of the debt market. And the things that we list off are essentially, that it's Oracle, it's external Oracle dependent, and there are risk assessors, and I forgot to get clarity on this, but it sounded like that there is a field where the risk rating becomes like a stuck to the thing, which implies that there are administrative permissions on the token contract, and combined with that, we assume that there are we heard from Phil himself, massive like legal and regulatory barriers to getting this done. Like altogether, I would say whatever this token would be or tokens would be, it's looking extremely complex, right? Do you think that the analytical framework that you have today, right, would be able to handle something of that level of complexity? Like to what extent do those design implementation decisions impact the score or whatever you would give to this thing?
I think that it depends on the quality of documentation, basically. But
actually, a perfect answer.
But let's think about. So I propose it. I mean, like a friendly advice and joke without no responsibility. I propose some token design, but we all understand that the value of this token will be tied to amount of defaults, because the more defaults is there, the less cash flow this token will get, right? And less will be like the value of underwriting all these debts. Less will be the value of issuing new debts. If you have a platform where a lot of debts are getting to default, so it means that lenders getting nothing. That means that the trust is going down. Nobody wants to go because your initial risk assessment is not correct. So, yeah, I just want to add some on top that all this, value capturing, origins of value mechanisms and stuff. They're based on the percentage of defaults. If there is too big percentage of defaults, it all goes to zero. I mean, the fundamental value of it.
Yeah, maybe one thing on this. So when we started this project, this originally originated quite a long time ago as a research project mostly. And initially we were kind of really thinking about, can we do something radically new on the token design? Maybe think about what could be the token here. I mean, you saw what we do now, which is relatively standard. And one of the reasons obviously is that if you come up with something fancy, then who understands what it actually is? What are the risks involved? And I mean, as you said, basically, that's part of the documentation. If you use standards that are well understood at some level, that's not enough. But of course, it makes it easier for people and also for systems to understand what are the consequences of this. And also goes through simulations, basically, right? The thing that I would maybe also kind of prompt from my side is that I mentioned and alluded to that the legal risks are hard. This is specifically if you go cross-country, where your underlying is a debt relationship between country A and country B, or parties in country A and parties in country B. The practice of going to court and basically enforcing some invoice can vary dramatically depending on where you are, right? And this is one of the things where it's very hard, and this is something also professionals on the pricing side struggle with a lot. What is the price? And I think AI actually could have a big advantage on this, because if you have enough data and collect it on all levels, there could actually be a way where you can price something better, which is very much highly unstructured, right? I mean, a zero coupon bond can be is structured and relatively straightforward.
I just want to add a few seconds. So your debt is a representation. Everything you built is a ensuring quality of the representation. Your interest rate is a future cash flow, and your pooling is a meta representation that collects all the chances of default. So basically, from the value capturing view, it's very simple. The question is about the implementation, how it really works, and this is much more complicated. But if I build this, what I will think about, I will think about to do this project inside one jurisdiction, like European Union, right? You can make invoice between Netherlands and Germany, like countries that are quite close and they understand legislation. Inside the United States, you have a lot of states and people inside. You can do it inside the United States. So the cross-border invoices, I think maybe it's the step 2 only.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to have to leave the conversation here. Audience, please join me in thanking our panelists. I think this was a terrific conversation.
Thank you so much.